the young age of 21, Sidney Hatch took the silver medal for the men's 4-mile team run in the 1904 Olympic Games. For most, such an award at such a young age could certainly suggest an early peak in life, but for Sidney, this was only just the beginning of his achievements. Born in the small town of River Forest, Illinois, Hatch was not only a 4-time Olympic competitor, but also ran 45 marathons over the course of his life, including the 96-mile Chicago to Milwaukee Marathon, for which he set a world record in 1916.
Hatch's running career was extensive and rewarding. Starting with that 1904 Olympic silver medal, 2 years after his Olympic victory, Hatch competed in and won the 1906 Missouri Athletics Club All-Western Marathon in St. Louis. He went on to compete in this race another 5 times, including in 1908. This race qualified him for the Olympic Games that year.
The next year, Hatch won the 96-mile race to Chicago and finished 6th in the Yonkers Marathon. By 1912, he was considered one of the 20 best runners in the American Midwest and qualified again for the Olympics in Sweden, but he chose not to compete. He took 3rd place in the Boston Marathon twice in 1915 and 1916, and took 2nd place in 1917.
It was shortly after his 2nd place Boston Marathon win that Hatch's whole life changed. In 1917, at the age of 35, Sidney Herbert Hatch joined the war efforts. He enlisted in the Army and became a message runner for the United States and France.
Meanwhile, on a world scale, the war to end all wars was raging across Europe and bleeding into the other continents. After Gavrilo Princip's assassination of Archduke Ferdinand and his wife, Austria-Hungary accused Serbia of being behind the attack and delivered to them an ultimatum. Despite Serbia's willingness to meet most of their demands, on July 28, 1914, Austria-Hungary declared war.
The declaration of war set off a number of chain reactions. Russia mobilized its troops. Germany, feeling threatened, declared war on Russia. Then, if things weren't already terrible, they really began to spiral out of control when Germany declared war on Russia's ally, France. In order to get to France, Germany attacked through neutral Belgium. Belgium then appealed to the British Empire, prompting them to enter the war.
To aid in the war, Britain called upon its entire empire for troops. They began drafting people from Canada, New Zealand, India, Australia, and South Africa. France also drew on its North African colonies, hailing the infamous Zouaves and Spahis. The war was now truly global. Even Asia got involved when Japanese forces attacked the port of Tsingtao, a German colony in China, taking it over. America finally joined the war towards its end in 1917 after the sinking of the Lusitania and the American civilians aboard, and the reveal of the Zimmermann telegram from Germany inciting Mexico to attack the United States.
America recruited and drafted a combined 4.8 million soldiers for the First World War. These soldiers spanned the various branches of the U.S. military and held various jobs, the most dangerous of which was the message runner. More reliable than staticky telephone calls or animal messengers, runners were typically low-ranking officers chosen for their speed, stamina, and their ability to read maps.
With that valuable skill set, runners weren't only used to send messages between camps. Often they were sent to scout out an area before troops moved through or to it. This was especially necessary when troops were moving under the cover of night. Being familiar with the terrain helped them move quieter and was easier to navigate.
To find their destination, they also had to be hardy and resourceful. They faced the risk of being taken out before they reached the destination or on their way back. Some referred to the runner's job as one of the hardest and most dangerous jobs in the infantry. According to World War I veteran Lieutenant Alan Dexter, with a runner it was merely a question of how long he would last before being wounded or killed. The majority of the war's soldiers could stay in the trenches, avoiding snipers and machine gun fire, but runners darted between the trenches and across enemy territory.
During the late stages of the war, when the Allied forces were constantly on the move, runners were critical for maintaining communication. To enhance their mobility and agility, runners were more lightly equipped than a typical soldier. They generally carried a sidearm, a haversack, and a canteen instead of a field pack and rifle. If it were after 1916, they would have been wearing a steel helmet, and they would have always have a gas mask.
Sidney Herbert Hatch volunteered for military service in 1917. After his skills in running and navigation were assessed, he was assigned the duty of a message runner and delivered countless messages between camps and around enemy lines. During October 1918 in Bruxelles, France, Hatch committed acts of outstanding bravery that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross and a Purple Heart.
These acts of bravery were as follows according to Hatch's local newspaper. Hatch was in a shell hole with the 1-pounder, an anti-aircraft gun, mounted to the rim when a heavy shell struck the edge, burying him under the dirt. When asked if he was hurt, he shrugged off his injury and continued his work despite the multiple pieces of shrapnel in his leg. Sergeant Hall, who was with Hatch at the time, said that at that moment there was an unusually heavy shelling. However, battalion headquarters needed to be notified of the change of position, so without hesitation, Hatch ran, injured, back to the headquarters 1,000 yards down the death path. After returning, he continued carrying ammunition until a sergeant discovered he had been wounded and sent him to an aid station.
In the spring of 1918, Germany overstretched themselves when they mounted a series of major offensives in France. This left the perfect space for the Allies to launch a secret counterattack known as the 100 Days Offensive. This launched several other important victories for the Allies, and an armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, forcing Germany to withdraw.
After the war, Hatch came home and ran 2 more Boston marathons before he retired from running. With his extra time, he became a letter carrier in River Forest, Illinois, eventually retiring in 1953 at the age of 70. In 1921, local newspapers read Great Runner Weds, informing the area that Sidney Hatch had taken Gertrude Morris as his wife. This came as a surprise to Hatch's family, as they had just met Morris days before and were not in attendance at the wedding. However, Hatch's brother recalls, "We weren't surprised. It's just like Sid to do things differently." Sidney and Gertrude went on to have 3 children, twins June and Jane and son Herbert.
During World War I, message runners were the only reliable method of communication. They became even more important when the war switched from mobile to trench warfare. Because of runners, elaborate attacks like the 100 Days Offensive could be pulled off by the Allies. This type of coordination could not have been executed without the vital communication provided by the message runners. Their jobs were high stakes and dangerous. Many men accepted their roles knowing it was unlikely they would return home. In spite of this, they risked their lives anyways, all for the sake of communication.